The steam rising from the porcelain cup was the only thing moving in Ji-hoon's immediate vicinity. A delicate, ghostly spiral that vanished before it could reach the height of his chin. The ballroom of the Grand Obsidian was a cavern of polished marble, gold leaf molding, and the low, murmuring hum of people who had never worried about the price of anything in their lives. It was an evening thick with the clinking of silver spoons and the performative laughter of elite families. Yet Ji-hoon sat alone at a table meant for four. He always sat at a table meant for four, a quiet, stubborn defiance against the reality of his isolation. At 32, wearing a bespoke black suit that cost more than a luxury sedan, he possessed a stillness that made the surrounding waitstaff visibly nervous. To the gala guests, he was the youngest chairman of the Black Crane Syndicate, a man whose business interests were as vast as they were terrifyingly efficient. To the rest of the world, he was a cold, impenetrable statue. He checked his watch, a piece of mechanical perfection, noting he had been enduring this social vacuum for exactly 19 minutes. The emptiness of the chair opposite him felt like a physical weight, a gravitational pull he resisted with a perfectly straight spine. He lifted the cup, the liquid fragrant and bitter, and that was when the periphery of his vision was invaded by a sudden coordinated movement of pastel pink. Two figures appeared at the edge of his table, moving with the silent, predatory grace of seasoned cat burglars, though they couldn't have been more than 7 years old. They were identical twins. Young girls with hair styled in matching puffs, their light pink dresses rustling softly as they halted. They stared at him with wide, intelligent eyes that seemed to be assessing his structural integrity. Ji-hoon paused, the teacup hovering halfway to his mouth. He was accustomed to people approaching him with trembling petitions for mercy or greed. He was not accustomed to children. He lowered the cup to the saucer with a soft, deliberate clink. The girl on the left placed her hands flat on the white tablecloth, leaning in conspiratorially. Her sister mirrored the action perfectly, their movements synchronized as if they shared a single operating system. They scanned the room for threats before the one on the left locked eyes with him. "Pretend you're our father," she whispered, the command urgent and breathless. Ji-hoon's mask of indifference cracked just a fraction. "Excuse me?" he said, his voice raspy from disuse. "Just for 20 minutes," the second twin hissed, checking over her shoulder. "We need a dad right now. The lady in the green coat is coming back, and if she sees us alone, she's going to take us." Ji-hoon looked past them. Emerging through the arched doorway was a woman in a striking green trench coat, her expression a predatory mix of focus and calculation. This was Elena, the Viper, a high-level fixer for a rival cartel. She was scanning the crowd with the eyes of a hawk hunting field mice. Ji-hoon looked back at the girls, noting the genuine terror vibrating behind their brave facades. "I am not the most convincing candidate," Ji-hoon said dryly, gesturing to his sharp features and the lethal aura that usually kept the world at bay. The first twin rolled her eyes with supreme impatience. "We're adopted in this scenario. Work with us, please." There was something in the girl's tone that caught him. It wasn't a beg, it was a negotiation. It was the sound of someone backed into a corner but refusing to surrender. A strange, unfamiliar spark flickered in Ji-hoon's chest, interrupting the gray monotony of his existence. As the woman in green locked her gaze onto the pink dresses, Ji-hoon made his choice. "Sit," he commanded, his voice a conspiratorial rumble. He reached out, pulling the twins closer to him, his large hands resting protectively on their small shoulders just as the clicking of high heels signaled Elena's arrival. As she reached the table, her eyes narrowing at the unexpected sight, Ji-hoon looked up with a look that had ended gang wars without a single punch thrown. "Is there a problem?" he asked, his tone silky and dangerous. The heavy air of the ballroom felt like a tightening noose as Ji-hoon stood, his hand resting firmly but gently on the shoulders of the two girls. Elena stood frozen at the edge of the table, her eyes darting between the twins and the man who was notoriously known for his cold apathy. To the outside world, he was simply a father comforting his children, but the exchange of looks between the chairman and the fixer was a silent declaration of war. Ji-hoon didn't wait for her to speak. He knew that in Elena's world, hesitation was an invitation for a strike. "The girls are tired," Ji-hoon announced, his voice carrying just enough volume to reach the ears of the nearby gala security. He signaled to his lead bodyguard, who was already closing the distance, and flashed a look that demanded an immediate perimeter. "It seems a family emergency requires our departure," he added, his tone clipped and professional. It was a lie designed to move them through the crowd without raising the alarm of the other high society guests. But the weight of the girl's hands in his made the facade feel dangerously real. As they began to move toward the grand exit, the atmosphere shifted from gilded elegance to a tactical chess match. Elena tapped her earpiece, and Ji-hoon watched three men in nondescript black suits detach themselves from the shadows of the marble pillars. They weren't gala security. They were the Viper's personal strike team, and they were moving with the synchronized hunger of wolves. Ji-hoon steered the twins, Chloe and Zoe, deeper into the center of the crowd, using the oblivious elite as a human shield. "Keep your heads down and count your steps," Ji-hoon whispered to the girls, his calm demeanor masking the fact that he was already calculating the most efficient way to kill the men following them if they reached the foyer. The twins didn't argue. They clung to his suit jacket, their small faces pale but determined. Every time Elena's men tried to cut them off, Ji-hoon's own security detail shifted like a living wall, blocking the path with polite but immovable force. They reached the grand foyer, where the valet was already idling Ji-hoon's armored phantom at the curb. The transition from the warm, scented air of the ballroom to the cold, damp night was a shock, but the real threat was the black SUV that had just swerved to block the driveway exit. Elena appeared in the doorway behind them, her green coat flapping like a shroud in the wind, her face no longer mimicking social graces. "Sir, the rear exit is compromised," his bodyguard murmured into his ear. Ji-hoon didn't flinch. He scooped both girls up, one in each arm, feeling their hearts racing against his chest. The weight of them was a revelation, a sudden, heavy responsibility that made his previous life of corporate mergers feel hollow. "Step on it," Ji-hoon commanded as he slid into the back of the armored car, pulling the girls into the footwell as the first muffled thud of a silenced round hit the reinforced glass. The car roared to life, tires screaming against the wet pavement as they breached the line of Elena's men. As the gala faded into a blur of gold light and gray shadows, Ji-hoon looked down at the two identical faces staring up at him in the dark. The 20 minutes were over, but the war for their lives had only just begun. The armored phantom glided into the private elevator bay of the Black Crane's flagship skyscraper with a hushed, predatory hum. Inside the penthouse, the air was sterile and quiet, smelling of expensive sandalwood and filtered oxygen, a sharp contrast to the chaotic rain and adrenaline of the escape. Ji-hoon shed his suit jacket, the movement fluid and weary, revealing the crisp white silk of his shirt. He moved to the kitchen island, his hands steady as he began the ritual of brewing a fresh pot of tea, not out of thirst, but for the grounding mechanical nature of the task. Chloe and Zoe hovered at the edge of the living area, their pink ruffles dampened and wilted. They didn't look like the master negotiators of the ballroom anymore. They looked small against the backdrop of floor-to-ceiling glass and the cold, gray expanse of the Seoul skyline. Ji-hoon felt the weight of their gaze on his back. As he reached for the ceramic cups, he rolled up his sleeves, exposing the intricate black ink that crawled from his wrists to his biceps, a violent tapestry of dragons and traditional Korean motifs that marked his rank and history. "Are they real?" Zoe whispered, stepping closer. Her voice was no longer a hissed command, but filled with a child's unfiltered wonder. Ji-hoon glanced down at the ink. "They are." "Did it hurt?" Chloe asked. venturing to the marble island. Her small finger hovered just an inch above a dragon's golden eye, etched into his forearm. Everything worth having usually does, Ji-hoon replied dryly. He watched them with a strange, detached fascination. In his world, tattoos were a warning, a ledger of sins and power. To these girls, they were simply a picture book. He set 2 cups of warm, honey-infused herbal tea before them, and for a moment, the silence was almost peaceful. But as the girls leaned forward to sip, the light from the overhead chandeliers caught the matching silver lockets resting against their chests. The jewelry was old, slightly tarnished, and out of place against their pristine party dresses. Ji-hoon's eyes narrowed. As a man who survived on the details others missed, he noticed the way the lockets didn't hang quite right. They had a density that suggested they weren't hollow. "Let me see those," Ji-hoon said, his voice regaining its authoritative edge. The twins shared a look, a brief flash of the synchronization he'd seen at the gala, before Chloe unclipped her chain and handed it to him. The silver was cold. Ji-hoon took a small, laser-edged pocket knife from the drawer and applied a precise amount of pressure to the locket's seam. It didn't pop open to reveal a photograph. Instead, the front casing slid back on a micro-hinge. Tucked into the velvet-lined interior was a transparent sliver of silicon and gold, a high-density microchip, the kind used for encrypted deep storage. Ji-hoon felt a cold thrill of realization. Elena wasn't hunting these girls for their lineage or a ransom. They were the couriers for something far more dangerous. "Where did you get these?" he asked, his gaze shifting to Zoe's locket, which he realized would likely contain the secondary encryption key. "Our mom said they were our life insurance," Zoe said softly, her eyes tracking the chip in his hand. "She said if we ever got lost, we just had to find the man who looks like the dragon, and he would know what to do with them." Ji-hoon looked at the ink on his arm, then back at the tiny billion-dollar burden sitting on his kitchen counter. He had been chosen. This wasn't a chance encounter. It was a long-game play by a dead woman who knew exactly which monster would be the best shield for her children. He stared at the tea, the steam rising in a familiar spiral, and realized that his quiet life of corporate shadows was officially a thing of the past. The morning sun struggled to pierce the floor-to-ceiling glass of Ji-hoon's office, leaving the room in a state of expensive, clinical gloom. He sat behind a desk of polished obsidian, the microchip from Chloe's locket resting between his thumb and forefinger like a grain of digital sand. The quiet was absolute, until the heavy oak doors groaned open. Elena entered without an invitation, her green trench coat sweeping against the minimalist carpet. She didn't look like a hunter anymore. She looked like a diplomat, though the coldness in her eyes suggested she was merely carrying a more sophisticated weapon. She didn't sit. She walked to the edge of his desk, her presence a sharp intrusion of vanilla and ozone. "You've had a busy night, Chairman," she said, her voice smooth and devoid of the panic she'd mimicked at the gala. "I imagine you've already discovered that those girls are carrying more than just childhood trauma. That chip is half of a ledger that could dismantle the European banking system. The other half is in the second locket." Ji-hoon didn't look up from the chip. "It's a remarkable piece of engineering," he noted, his tone conversational. "It's also a death sentence for anyone holding it. Why bring that heat into my city?" Elena leaned forward, her hands resting on the obsidian surface. "Because my employers want it back, and they are willing to pay a king's ransom for the inconvenience. Hand over the girls, and the Black Crane Syndicate gets a permanent seat at the high table in Geneva. Total legitimacy. No more hiding in the shadows of Seoul. I.e., you become a global statesman, Ji-hoon, all for the price of 2 children who aren't even yours." For a long moment, the only sound was the hum of the building's climate control. Ji-hoon finally looked up, his dark eyes flat and unreadable. He thought of the twins in the next room, currently arguing over which cereal had the most marshmallows, oblivious to the fact that they were being discussed as line items in a corporate merger. He thought of the way Chloe had touched his tattoos, seeing a protector where everyone else saw a ghost. The deal is lopsided, Ji-hoon said, his voice dropping to a dangerous, low-frequency rumble. Elena's lips curled into a thin, triumphant smile. Everything is negotiable. Name your price. You misunderstand, Ji-hoon replied, standing slowly. He rolled up his sleeves, in the black ink of the dragon appearing to coil around his forearms in the shifting light. I am not negotiating for the ledger. I am informing you that the assets you are looking for no longer exist. Those girls are under my protection. Elena's smile faltered. Don't be a fool, Ji-hoon. You're a man of logic. You don't start a war with a global cartel over a whim of sentimentality. They aren't yours. Ji-hoon walked around the desk, stopping just inches from her. He was a head taller, a wall of bespoke wool and lethal intent. Last night at the gala they asked me to pretend, he said, his voice silky and absolute. But I find that I don't like pretending. From this moment on, their names are on my family register. They are my daughters. And if you or your employers so much as breathe in their direction, I will burn your world down to the foundation. The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of an unofficial declaration of war. Elena searched his face for a hint of a bluff, but found only the terrifying conviction of a man who had finally found something worth more than his own power. She stepped back, her hand reaching for her phone as she retreated toward the door. You've just signed your own death warrant, she hissed. Perhaps, Ji-hoon said, returning to his seat and picking up his teacup. But at least I won't be dying alone at a table for 4. The private park was an island of manicured green amidst the jagged glass skyline of Seoul, a sanctuary Ji-hoon had cleared with a single phone call. He sat on a stone bench, the weight of a heavy tactical pistol hidden by the drape of his overcoat, watching Chloe and Zoe sprint through the grass. They were no longer in the stiff ruffles of the gala. They wore denim and bright sneakers, looking like the children they were supposed to be. For a moment, the air was filled with nothing but the scent of freshly cut clover and the high, bright sound of their laughter. Papa, look! I'm faster than a bullet! Zoe shouted, her arms outstretched as she pivoted around a cherry blossom tree. Ji-hoon's phone vibrated, a sharp, rhythmic pulse in his pocket. It was his head of security. Sir, the perimeter is cold. We have a breach at the north gate. 4 operatives, non-syndicate. They're moving fast. Ji-hoon didn't flinch. He didn't even stand up. He watched the tree line, his eyes tracking the subtle disturbance in the foliage. Elena's men hadn't waited for the ink to dry on his declaration of war. They were here to reclaim the biological keys. He saw the glint of sunlight on a barrel 100 yards out. Girls, Ji-hoon called out, his voice calm, projecting the steady authority of a game master. Do you remember what we talked about this morning? The special rehearsal? The twins skidded to a halt, their eyes lighting up. The superhero training? Chloe asked, breathless. Exactly, Ji-hoon said, standing slowly and unbuttoning his coat to free his arms. The bad guys are going to try and tag you. Your job is to stay behind the dragon's shield and never look back. If you hear loud noises, those are just the special effects. Do you understand? They nodded in perfect, terrifying synchronization. As the first operative stepped from behind a stone pillar, Ji-hoon moved. He was a blur of dark wool and lethal precision. He didn't draw his weapon yet. He didn't want the girls to see the muzzle flash. Instead, he intercepted the first man with a brutal, short arc strike to the throat, using his body to mask the impact from the twins' view. Step to the left, Zoe. Keep the rhythm, Ji-hoon commanded, his voice as steady as if he were reciting a nursery rhyme. He spun, catching the second attacker's wrist, the snap of bone masked by the sudden burst of the park's automated sprinklers. Water hissed into the air, creating a shimmering, translucent curtain. To the twins, it was part of the spectacle. They giggled, dancing through the spray as Ji-hoon neutralized the third man with a devastating leg sweep and a palm strike that sent the operative into the unconscious dark. The fourth man, realizing the physical confrontation was a lost cause, reached for a silenced sidearm. Ji-hoon didn't hesitate. He pulled the girls into the hollow of a large decorative boulder, shielding them with his own back. He drew his weapon and fired 2 shots in rapid succession, muted thwips that sounded more like a stapler than a gun. The operative fell. "Is the rehearsal over?" Chloe asked, peering out from under his arm, her face glowing with excitement. "Did we win?" Ji-hoon holstered his weapon, his heart rate barely elevated, though his shirt was damp from the sprinklers. He looked at the fallen men, shadows in the distance, and then back at the 2 innocent faces that trusted him to turn a battlefield into a playground. "You did perfectly," Ji-hoon said, reaching out to tuck a stray hair behind Zoe's ear. He felt the cold metal of her locket against his knuckles, the chip, the burden, the reason they were hunted. "But the rehearsal is just the beginning. The real performance is going to require more than just running." He stood up, scanning the perimeter as his secondary security team finally swarmed the park to clean up the props. He took each girl by the hand, their small palms warm against his scarred skin. He had promised them a normal day, but as they walked toward the armored car, he realized that in his world, normalcy was the most expensive lie of all. The penthouse was bathed in the bruised purple light of a soul twilight, the city below a shimmering grid of indifference. Inside, the only sound was the soft, rhythmic clicking of a digital tablet as Ji-hoon scrolled through a decrypted file, a ghost's confession delivered via a hidden partition in the twins' microchips. Chloe and Zoe were asleep on the oversized velvet sofa, exhausted from their superhero training, their breathing the only thing tethering the room to a sense of peace. Ji-hoon stared at a photograph that had flickered onto the screen. It was a woman with the same intelligent, wide eyes as the girls, standing in a high-security lab. This was Dr. Min-ah, the lead biocryptographer for the very cartel Elena represented. As the audio file began to play, her voice, thin and strained, filled the room. She hadn't been a traitor to her employers. She had been a mother who realized her children were being groomed as the ultimate biometric failsafes for a global slush fund. "If you are hearing this, Chairman Kang, it means I am dead, and my daughters have found the dragon," the voice whispered. Ji-hoon leaned back, his eyes fixed on the dragon ink coiling around his wrist. "I spent years building their cage. I encoded the Shadow Fund access keys into their DNA, and the activation sequence is hidden in a rhyme I taught them. My employers see them as hardware. I see them as my heart." The recording paused, the hiss of static filling the silence. Ji-hoon realized the gravity of the gamble Min-ah had taken. She hadn't chosen a hero to protect them. She had chosen the most dangerous man she knew. She had chosen a man who understood the value of a seat at the table, but possessed the stubborn, lethal pride to flip that table over if he didn't like the company. "I didn't send them to you because you are a good man. Ah, Ji-hoon," the recording continued, a ghostly chuckle mirroring his own dark humor. "I sent them to you because you are the only man in this hemisphere powerful enough to say no to the people who own me. You are the only one who doesn't need their money and isn't afraid of their shadows. Please, be the monster that keeps the other monsters away from them." The file ended, leaving the room in a heavy, cold silence. Ji-hoon looked at the twins. They weren't just accidental refugees. They were a living weapon, a multi-billion-dollar inheritance wrapped in pink ruffles and innocence. Min-ah had calculated his vanity perfectly. She knew he wouldn't hand them over, because to do so would be to admit there was a power greater than the Black Crane. Chloe stirred in her sleep, her small hand reaching out instinctively to find her sister's. Ji-hoon felt a strange, tightening sensation in his throat. A sensation he hadn't felt in the 3 years since he'd buried his own past. He wasn't just their protector anymore. He was the executor of a dead woman's final act of defiance. He stood up, walking to the window to watch the rain begin to streak against the glass. He had spent his life building a legacy of fear and efficient violence, believing that connections were the rust that destroyed an empire. But as he looked at the reflection of the two girls in the glass, he realized that Minna had given him something he hadn't known he lacked. A reason to be more than just a ghost at a table for four. He wasn't just a boss or a chairman anymore. He was the guardian of the keys, and the world was about to find out exactly how much he was willing to burn to keep them safe. The boardroom was a tomb of glass and polished mahogany, suspended 50 floors above the smog of the city. Ji-hoon sat at the head of the table, his posture an exercise in deceptive relaxation, while the 12 directors of the Black Crane Syndicate stared back at him with eyes like cold marbles. Usually, this room was a chorus of agreement, a machine that turned his will into reality. Today, the air was thick with the scent of expensive cologne and the sour tang of impending mutiny. "The diamond merger is stalled, Chairman," Elder Park said, his voice a dry rasp that carried the weight of 4 decades of underworld politics. He tapped a finger on a dossier containing grainy surveillance photos of the twins at the park. "The European cartel has made their terms clear. The girls are the collateral for the shadow fund. Without them, there is no merger. There is no global expansion. There is only a war we did not vote for." Ji-hoon didn't blink. He lifted his tea, the steam ghosting over his sharp features. "The girls are not collateral," he said, his voice low and rhythmic. "They are members of this house. We do not trade our own for a seat at a foreign table." A ripple of uneasy murmurs broke the silence. Director Han, the youngest on the board and a man Ji-hoon had personally promoted, leaned forward. "With all due respect, sir, they are children of a scientist from a rival house. They are assets. We are a criminal organization, not an orphanage. The board has held a private session. We are unanimous. You will hand them over to Elena by midnight, or the Black Crane will find a leader whose priorities are aligned with the bottom line." The threat hung in the air, naked and jagged. Ji-hoon felt a cold, familiar clarity wash over him. He looked around the table, searching for a single flicker of loyalty, a single face that remembered the blood he had spilled to build the very chairs they sat in. He found nothing but greed and the hollow calculation of men who saw the world as a series of transactions. He was the dragon, but he realized with a jolt of ice in his veins that he was a dragon whose horde was being picked apart by the very people he had raised. "You speak of priorities," Ji-hoon said, setting his cup down with a click that sounded like a hammer falling on a firing pin. He stood up, the movement slow and predatory. "You want the merger because you are tired of the shadows. You want to be legitimate businessmen. But you forget that legitimacy is earned through strength, not through the sale of children to a laboratory." "We are not asking, Ji-hoon," Elder Park countered, his voice hardening. "The security teams on the lower floors have already been reassigned. Your personal detail has been neutralized. You are a king without an army in this room." Ji-hoon felt the trap snap shut. He was alone in the heart of his own empire, surrounded by men who had already spent the silver they expected to earn from his betrayal. He thought of Chloe and Zoe back at the penthouse, likely playing with the high-tech gadgets he'd given them, unaware that their father had just been deposed by a vote. He didn't argue. He didn't shout. He simply adjusted his cuffs, the black ink of his tattoos visible beneath the white silk of his sleeves. "You want to know my priority?" he asked, a faint, terrifying smile touching his lips. "My priority is ensuring that when I burn this building to the ground, none of you are left to see the ashes." He turned and walked toward the door. No one moved to stop him. They didn't need to. They believed they had already won, that the cold logic of the board had finally broken the chairman's grip. As the heavy doors closed behind him, Ji-hoon pulled his burner phone from his pocket. He didn't call his security. He didn't call his lawyers. He called the one person who knew how to move through the city's veins without being seen. The war was no longer just at the gates, it was inside the house. And as the elevator descended into the dark, Ji-hoon realized he was no longer fighting for a syndicate. He was fighting for a family he hadn't known he wanted, and a ghost who had known him better than he knew himself. The neon pulse of the city felt like a fever dream as Ji-hoon navigated the armored car through the rain-slicked streets of Myeongdong. The message had come from his most trusted lieutenant, a short, urgent burst claiming Elena had been spotted at a secondary safe house near the old central hub. It was a trap, and Ji-hoon knew it the moment he pulled into the desolate concrete ribs of the underground parking structure. The silence wasn't the respectful quiet of his territory. It was the hollow, breathless stillness of an ambush. "Stay in the car," Ji-hoon commanded, his eyes fixed on the rearview mirror where a second black sedan had just swerved to block the ramp. Chloe and Zoe sat in the back, their faces pale in the dim cabin light, clutching the matching lockets that had become their talons. "Is this more training, Papa?" Zoe whispered, her voice trembling just enough to betray her bravado. "The final exam," Ji-hoon replied, his voice a low, soothing rumble. He stepped out of the car, his overcoat flared like a shadow. 10 of his own men who wore the black crane pin on their lapels, emerged from the darkness. They didn't look him in the eye. They looked at the car. The betrayal was surgical. His lieutenant stepped forward, his hand hovering over a sidearm. "The board's orders were absolute, Chairman. Hand over the keys and you can walk away. Don't make us do this in front of them." Ji-hoon didn't answer with words. He moved with the terrifying fluidity of a man who had nothing left to lose but the 2 lives behind the glass. He used the car door as a shield, his first 2 shots finding their mark with the clinical efficiency that had made him a legend. But the sheer weight of the numbers was against him. He lunged back into the driver's seat, threw the Phantom into reverse, and slammed into the blocking sedan, the screech of metal on metal echoing like a dying scream. "Out. Now!" he roared as the car stalled, the engine smoking. He scooped the twins into his arms, shielding their heads as he dove through a service door that led toward the belly of the city. They emerged into the frantic, echoing labyrinth of the Seoul subway system. It was the rush hour of the damned, a sea of commuters, flickering fluorescent lights, and the distant, rhythmic thunder of approaching trains. Ji-hoon stripped off his blood-stained overcoat, his white shirt now a target, his tattoos exposed and pulsing with the heat of his exertion. He could hear the heavy boots of his former soldiers echoing down the tiled stairs behind them. "We have to go where the dragon hides," he muttered, more to himself than the girls, as he pulled them onto a departing Line 4 train, just as the doors hissed shut. The subway car was crowded, a surreal contrast of mundane life and high-stakes death. Ji-hoon stood at the center, his hand gripping the overhead rail, his other arm wrapped around both girls, pulling them into the hollow of his chest. He looked at the window, his reflection ghostly against the dark tunnel walls. He saw a man who had been stripped of his empire, his wealth, and his shadow, leaving only a predator protectively curled around his young. The twins looked up at him, and their intelligent eyes seeing the blood on his cuff, the sweat on his brow, and the cold, hard focus in his gaze. They didn't cry. They simply gripped his waist, their small fingers digging into the expensive fabric of his trousers. "They're still coming, aren't they?" Chloe asked, her voice steady despite the rattling of the train. "Let them come," Ji-hoon said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that promised a dark and total retribution. "They think they took my power because they took my office. They forgot that I am the one who taught them how to hunt." As the train screeched toward the next station, Ji-hoon watched the doors. He knew Elena would be waiting at the terminus. He knew his board was celebrating his fall. But as he felt the warmth of the twins against him, he realized he wasn't fleeing. He was repositioning. The subway was a vein, and he was the poison moving toward the heart of those who had dared to touch what was his. The sky over the penthouse garden was a bruised electric purple, heavy with the scent of ozone and the coming storm. Ji-hoon stood at the center of the rooftop sanctuary, his white shirt torn and stained with the grime of the subways, yet he held himself with a terrifying, jagged grace. He had circled back to the heart of his empire, not to reclaim his throne, but to burn the bridge behind him. Chloe and Zoe stood behind him, tucked into the shadow of a stone koi pond, their eyes fixed on the woman in the green coat who waited by the edge of the infinity pool. Elena was no longer a diplomat. She held a sleek, suppressed submachine gun with the casual familiarity of a violinist holding a bow. Around her, each the remnants of Ji-hoon's board of directors stood like vultures, their faces pale with greed and the fear of the man they had tried to bury. "The game is over, Ji-hoon," Elena said, her voice cutting through the wind. "The subways were a clever detour, but every road in this city leads back to me. Give me the lockets, and I might let you keep your life. You can go back to being the man alone at the table. No one has to die for a legacy that isn't yours." Ji-hoon looked at the men who had once called him chairman. He looked at the vast, shimmering wealth of the city spread out below them, a world he had spent 15 years conquering. Then, he reached into his pocket and pulled out the 2 silver lockets. The gold and silicon chips inside were the only thing keeping the high table from obliterating the girls, and the only thing keeping the board's greed alive. "You speak of legacies," Ji-hoon said, his voice a low, vibrating growl that seemed to command the very air. He looked at the twins. "Chloe, Zoe, do you remember the rhyme?" The girls stepped forward, their voices small but clear, speaking in a haunting, melodic synchronization. As they recited the complex string of nonsense words, the phonetic key to the decryption, Ji-hoon pulled a high-intensity thermal charge from his belt. "What are you doing?" Elder Park shrieked, stepping forward. "That's billions. That's our future." "No," Ji-hoon said, his eyes locking onto Elena's. "That's their cage." With a fluid, violent motion, Ji-hoon crushed the lockets together and triggered the thermal charge. A brilliant, blinding white flare erupted in his hand, and the intense heat melting the silver and vaporizing the delicate microchips within seconds. The biological keys were gone, turned into a handful of scorched slag. The digital inheritance, the shadow fund, and the leverage of the European cartel vanished into the wind as ash. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the hiss of rain finally beginning to fall. Elena's face contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. She raised her weapon, but Ji-hoon was already moving, a dragon unleashed. He didn't fire a gun. He moved with a primal, visceral fury, closing the distance before she could pull the trigger. He caught the barrel of the weapon, twisting it with a sickening snap of metal and bone. Elena lunged with a hidden blade, but Ji-hoon parried with his forearm. The ink of his tattoos slick with rain as he drove a palm strike into her chest that sent her reeling toward the edge of the infinity pool. He stood over her, the rain washing the blood from his knuckles. He didn't kill her. To kill her would be to keep the war alive. Instead, he looked at the board members, who were shrinking back in terror. "The fund is gone," Ji-hoon announced, his voice echoing off the glass. "There is no more profit in these girls. There is no more merger. You wanted a leader who looked at the bottom line? Look at it now. You have nothing." He turned his back on them, an act of supreme confidence and total dismissal. He walked to the koi pond and scooped the twins into his arms. They clung to his neck, their small heartbeats finally slowing as the adrenaline faded. The dragon had destroyed his hoard to save his heart. "Is the play over, Papa?" Chloe whispered into his ear. Ji-hoon looked out at the city, no longer seeing a grid to be conquered, but a home to be built. "The play is over," he said softly. "Now, we start the real story." The steam rising from the porcelain cup was the only thing moving in Ji-hoon's immediate vicinity, a delicate, ghostly spiral that vanished into the warm afternoon air. The setting was no longer a cavernous ballroom of cold marble and high-stakes whispers, but a small, sun-drenched cafe bordering a public park. The table was simple wood, scarred by the history of 1,000 ordinary lives, and for the first time in his life, Ji-hoon sat at a table meant for four and felt no phantom weight in the empty chairs. He was no longer the chairman of the Black Crane. The suit he wore was still bespoke, but the sharp, lethal edges of his silhouette had been softened by the sunlight and the absence of a concealed weapon. His empire had been dismantled, purged of the vipers and the elders who had traded souls for percentages. In its place stood a lean, legitimate logistics firm, a business that dealt in crates and schedules rather than shadows and blood. He had traded his throne for a life where he could walk the streets without checking every rooftop for a glint of glass. A sudden, rhythmic thud of sneakers on grass announced the arrival of the only two people in the world who didn't fear the dragon etched into his skin. Chloe and Zoe skidded to a halt at the table, their faces flushed with the exertion of a playground dispute. They weren't wearing the ruffles of a gala or the denim of a fugitive. They wore school uniforms and the easy, unburdened expressions of children who knew exactly where they belonged. Papa, Zoe says that the clouds are made of cotton candy, but I told her that's scientifically impossible, Chloe announced, dropping her backpack onto the third chair with a sense of permanent ownership. Ji-hoon lowered his tea, a faint, genuine smile touching the corners of his mouth, a look that would have baffled his former board of directors. A strategist must always weigh observation against theory, he said, his voice a warm rumble. Perhaps you are both right. It depends on the light. Zoe scrambled into the fourth chair, leaning in with that same conspiratorial grace she had shown months ago in the tea room. Are we having the special tea today? The one with the extra honey? And the cake, Ji-hoon added, signaling a waiter who didn't tremble when he approached. Whatever the young ladies want. As the girls descended into a vibrant, chaotic debate about their upcoming science fair, Ji-hoon leaned back and watched them. The lockets were gone, destroyed in the fire of his old life. But the memory of the biological keys had been replaced by something far more durable. He looked at his forearms, where the ink of the dragon peeked out from beneath his rolled-up sleeves. Once, these tattoos were a map of his violence. Now, they were just stories he told the girls before bed. Edited versions where the monsters always lost and the protector always stayed. The silence that had once defined his existence was gone, replaced by the beautiful, messy noise of a family. He realized then that Dr. Minna had been right. He had been the only man powerful enough to say no to the world, but he hadn't known what he was saying yes to until these two had whispered a plea into his life. He wasn't a ghost at a table for four anymore. He was a man who had walked out of the shadows and into the light, guided by the hands of two children who had seen a father where everyone else saw a king. As the waiter arrived with a three-tiered stand of pastries, Ji-hoon didn't look at his watch. He wasn't waiting for anything. He was already exactly where he needed to be.